What's going on, guys? This is Lior and welcome back to my channel. Now, what I thought I would do in this video is tackle a question that I've been getting a lot recently, especially from newer investors and potential developers that want to break into business. And that is, what are the real differences between doing a project that's fully ground up versus maybe that's something a gut rehab, right? So what I'll do in this video is first define the differences between them two, and then talk about them from a permitting and zoning perspective, from a financial perspective, and of course a risk perspective. So we're gonna tackle it right now. What's going on, guys? My name is Lior and welcome back to my channel. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of this video, two super quick things, guys. Number one, if this is your first time on my channel, first of all, welcome. Second of all, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I am putting content on this channel talking all about multifamily investing, development, and everything in between. So if you're interested in multifamily, real estate development, this is the channel for you. And number two, guys, if you have any questions about real estate, you've been thinking about investing in projects or anything in between, make sure you reach out to me. I am happy to be a resource through your investing journeys. So now let's get right into the meat and potatoes. So as I said, right, what we're going to talk about in this video are the key differences between gut rehabs and new development. And before we actually go into some of the different key differences, let's actually define so we're exactly on the same page of what's what, right? So when I say new development, right, I literally mean brand new construction, right? So that means you're taking a vacant piece of land, or potentially there's a current structure on there that needs to be fully, demoed, and you're going to build fully brand new project. You're going to excavate the lot. You're going to pour a new foundation. You're going to go up with a brand new structure. Now, gut rehab is different in the sense that with a gut, even though there's a lot of construction involved, we are typically keeping the existing foundation and usually the shell of the original building, right? So what we'll do is we'll demo the building, the interior of the building, basically all the way to its studs, right? So you'll see, basically whatever studs are left over, you'll see the sheathing inside, but you're basically going to start fully from scratch, but you're going to keep the shell and the foundation in place. So now that we kind of defined exactly what's what, let's actually dive into some of the key differences you need to understand between these two types of projects, right? So number one, and very, very important, is permitting and zoning. So first, let's start with gut rehab, right? So when we talk about gut rehab, again, we're keeping the shell of the building. So typically from a zoning perspective, you don't typically need permission to gut your building, right? It's typically, most of the times you're going to be doing projects what's called as of right, because again, you're just taking current square footage that you have in your building and you're just basically renovating it from scratch. Now, if you're going to do something creative, like you're going to try to finish additional square footage that's currently not finished, maybe in the basement, maybe in the attic, or whatever, at that point, you might want to talk to your architect, because then you might trigger some FAR violations or something within your city zoning ordinance where you might actually need to get some sort of relief from the city in order to do your project. So, there are instances when that does happen, but as a general rule of thumb, if you're just gutting existing square footage that's already existing there, you're probably most likely going to be okay and don't need additional zoning relief. Now, in terms of the permitting process, right, to actually get your building permit, there's still that goes quite a bit into gut renovations, right? Because, again, you got to think about it. You're most likely you're reframing the building, you're creating new layouts, you're obviously going to have new plumbing, electric, HVAC, insulation, all new windows, everything, right? So in Boston, for example, the typical permitting package, what you need, and I have my list right here that I literally use, right? So in Boston, for example, in order to get a building permit, what you typically need are architectural plans, structural plans. You're going to need a survey. You're typically going to need HERS or energy compliance reports. If you're doing a multifamily, in Boston, it's anything more than 2 units. You're going to need fire protection documents, right? So that includes fire alarm and sprinkler documentation. You might need some water sewer plans. So there's quite a bit that goes into actually submitting to the city to receive your building permit. again, and I can only talk from the experience of Boston because that's where I operate. Typically, all that takes me, maybe 45, 60 days or so to gather. And then, when we submit for the permit, usually we hear back within 30 to 60 days. So it does take some time. It's not like you can, decide I want to gut my building and you can start tomorrow. There's usually a fair amount that goes into that building permit process. Now, let's talk about new construction. Now, with new construction, first, zoning tends to be very, very different, right? Now, this will also depend on the types of neighborhoods and the types of cities you operate in. And I operate in a couple of different ones, so I'll give you a couple of different examples. So in the city, when I operate in Boston and I'm looking to typically build multifamily, generally it's almost, I don't want to say impossible, but maybe almost impossible to find what we call as of right projects, right? Because most lots here are, you just won't be able to fit in a multifamily building into the type of lots that exist around the city. So you're gonna typically need relief on things like unit count, parking, FAR, setbacks, and various other factors that your architect and zoning attorney can talk about, right? So what will happen is if you're gonna go buy a piece of land or something that you're gonna wanna knock down and say build 5, 10, 15 units, whatever, typically what happens is you need to go get relief from the city, right? So this is it is a process, can take, in the city can take 12, 15 months easily. Sometimes in the suburbs, it can go a little faster. But basically what's gonna happen is you're gonna work with your architect and zoning attorney to ask for relief or rezone the lot to get the type of project that you wanna propose. Now, sometimes if you're working in the suburbs, right, and again, this is why your local market really matters, it is possible to get more by right projects, right? So in the suburbs, for example, I've got a couple of single family new construction projects I'm doing. Those are sometimes easier to get as a by right because you're typically dealing with larger lots. If you're doing a single family or maybe 2 townhomes, it's not like you're looking for huge density where you're going to need relief for that, right? So it is much easier to do by right projects where you don't need additional zoning relief. If you're maybe doing smaller projects, you're operating in suburbs with larger lots. I got to say it again. I'm going to probably say it through the video a bunch of times. Very much market dependent, very much city dependent. So just make sure you do your own due diligence depending on where you want to operate, where you want to do projects, and so on. Now, in terms of getting the building permit, all the things that we talked about that are required for the gut renovation certainly apply to new construction. And then typically you have add-ons, right? So, some common things that you're probably going to need in new construction, things like stormwater management plans. You're going to need very detailed structural plans. If you're doing multifamily, you're probably going to need mechanical plans, right? MEP plans. You might need to do geotech reports, potential borings for water tables, right? So there's definitely more that goes into applying for a building permit. Now, also, if you're going to be demoing an existing structure, there's a whole typical demo checklist, right? There's a lot of things that you need to do from the city's perspective before you can even go and demo the existing structure, right? So it is a much more hands-on and intense process in terms of getting the permit when you're dealing with new construction. I would say, again, roughly outside the city, probably can get permitted within 4 to 6 months is probably an average timeline. Maybe some people can do it faster, maybe a little slower. In the city, again, give or take, really depends on the size of the project. But you do need to understand that there's a lot that goes into it. It's not like you just file your architectural plans, you're good to go, right? There's a lot of different components that are truly, truly critical. Now, let's talk about the financing angles between the 2 different types of projects. So with gut renovations, it's probably a little bit more straightforward if you're familiar with the general value add business model, right? You can generally get relatively favorable debt from, commercial lenders, local community banks, right? Usually what I see from these types of projects from banks is, on your acquisition side, you're probably going to be getting anywhere from, 60 to 65% up to 75% of leverage on the acquisition. And then typically 90 to 100% of your construction proceeds that you're going to need for the project, right? So very similar to value add projects. If you guys maybe have done, kitchen bath jobs and you've taken construction funds from a bank, it operates in a very, very similar manner. But with land, it is a little different and does have some intricacies, right? So let's say you wanted to go buy a vacant parcel of land that you need to go get zoning relief from in order to build on. Well, if you're going to go close on that land, let's say in a couple of weeks, and then start the zoning relief process, and you go to a bank, they're not necessarily going to give you super high leverage, right? Because for them, that's a pretty risky proposition. And we'll talk about risk on the next step. But there's risk that what happens if you don't get approved for what you think you can get approved for. We don't know, right? So typically on land, what I've seen in the past is maybe leverage of 40 to 50% from banks or commercial lenders. Again, they're going to make you put a lot more equity into the deal because there's a lot more risk involved. But let's say you're going to go, let's say maybe you're closing on an approved project or it's a fully by right project. Then you could probably get a little bit closer to traditional, to kind of that gut rehab financial structure where, again, a bank might come in for anywhere from 60 to 75% of your acquisition cost. And then again, anywhere from maybe 80 to 100% of your construction proceeds. Probably the biggest difference with a little bit larger construction projects is a lot of lenders will make you put the initial equity into the construction. So what that means is, let's say a bank will say, hey, we're going to fund, 80, 85, 90% of your construction. What they might say is, hey, that first 10 to 15% of the construction, right? Let's say maybe that includes excavation work, maybe initial foundation pouring, stuff like that. You might have to do it as cash so that you're putting your cash equity into the deal, and then we'll fund basically the rest of the project, right? So that's something that you may or may not see depending on the size of your project. On my smaller stuff, I haven't seen that. As I'm getting into larger stuff, I certainly have seen banks require that. Next, let's talk about this from a risk perspective, because I think this is a really, really important perspective to talk about. So from a risk perspective, when you're doing a gut rehab, look, you're basically demoing all of the interior to the studs. So it's not like there's much more things you can find behind the wall. You kind of know that you're starting with a blank shell and you kind of have to start with everything. Probably the riskiest thing is maybe if you misevaluated any potential foundation issues, maybe you have to do some resupporting, maybe the shell or the sheathing needs some work, but besides that, you're probably not going to get hit with a ton of unknowns. Again, at the end of the day, you're kind of starting with a vacant shell. You're already going to have your framing and structural plans, and you kind of just work from there. Now, it is actually very different than with ground up construction, right? Because with ground up, probably one of the riskiest part of a ground up development is basically, what I call your horizontal, right? So before you go out vertical, before you actually start framing your project, all that work that you have to do in the dirt is definitely the riskiest, right? Because, when you're excavating your site, you never know what you're going to find. We found some interesting things when we've excavated. We found additional water issues that we didn't know about, right? Because you can do all sorts of testings up front before you actually start to dig and, do the work. But at the end of the day, you don't actually know, you may get surprised with what you actually find once you excavate, right? So that initial excavation, finding all the, really going through everything of the site, the soil issues, then actually pouring the foundation. All those issues are definitely the riskiest part of the project. Once you can actually do all that and then you start actually framing up, after that, it's pretty similar to a gut rehab, right? You're basically just doing a lot of framing, your MEPs come in, and then the rest is pretty easy. At least from a construction standpoint, it's really that groundwork, right? It's really that excavation, the foundation work, that there's just a lot of risk in. Sometimes you just don't know what you're going to find. So that's definitely the riskiest part. And that's something that you need to be prepared for if you're going to be going after new construction, right? There's just some unknowns that need to be handled as they come up. And finally, the last thing we'll kind of quickly touch upon, which has a lot of variance and again is very market dependent, right? It's that same caveat, is budgeting, right? So in terms of budgeting, obviously, as you might expect, gut rehabs are a lot cheaper to do than, the new construction. With gut rehabs, I can, and I'll tell you my general numbers. Again, this can significantly vary for your market. If you're in a much smaller market or much more, or if you're in New York City, that might differ completely based on my numbers. But, for gut rehabs, generally my projects here, I'm usually anywhere $150 to $170 per square foot, depending on the extent of work and the level of finish. With new construction, I certainly have seen variance. On smaller single-family projects, we're probably somewhere around the $225 to $250 per square foot range. But I'm also doing some larger multifamily developments now where we're coming in at north of 300, like 325 per square foot, right? So there is definitely a variance even within new construction itself. but just obviously understanding that, there is a significant price differential between doing these gut renovations versus new construction is at least important to understand from a high level. So that's kind of my overview. Hopefully that kind of gives you, some of the key things to think about if you've been contemplating moving from gut renovations to new construction, or if you kind of wanted to know the differences between two. These are some of the important angles you want to definitely be aware of as you think about these two different types of projects. So hopefully